Hi, everybody. I'll start with a quick intro, both of us, and then we'll jump right into Q&A, and a quick presentation about behavioral data and how it's being leveraged by marketplaces to prevent fraud, scams, and many other types of abuse. So, quick background on myself. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Incognia. Come from a technical background in computer science. Have been working particularly with location technologies for over 10 years, and more recently started Incognia to apply these learnings on like the trust and safety environment, on leveraging particularly location data, behavioral information to help companies reduce fraud and risk. I'm a second-time founder, so my previous company was also in the location space, but more related to location-based marketing. So now I'd say I'm on the good side here, applying this to fight fraud and other stuff. Thanks, everybody. I'll let Wale introduce himself.
Hey, everybody. My name is Wale Ayantoye. I'm the Director of Financial Crime Operation at Etsy. I've been in the financial crime space for over 10 years now, and I've had the privilege of scaling and building compliance program virtually, without bragging, nearly all continents as of today. Understanding how financial crime works across different jurisdictions, I have the privilege of being part of the team that developed and scaled Cash App from the beginning. Work on Florida Wave, where I manage over 38 countries, regulatory program across different countries. I'm not going to bore you with all of those bios, but I think we're here today to discuss impacts of financial crime, fraud, ATOs, and the rest of nuances when it comes to the marketplace, P2P, P2B space, which I'm very excited to speak about today. Thank you.
Thanks, Wale. So let's jump right into the questions. So the first one I have for you is around the, like, how do you compare the impact of these types of fraud that we're going to discuss today? Card-not-present fraud, promotion and refund abuse, money laundering, ATOs, et cetera. Like, what keeps you up at night?
That's a very good question. Like, what keeps me up at night? It's so funny because when I started this journey, I never had high blood pressure. But as you go and grow through the journey, you realize that it's a mental game, it's a chess game. Every time you develop new products, you start thinking about controls around those products. Because overall, the end goal is to create a product that helps and makes life way easier, more than we could imagine. And a quick story about that was a couple of years ago, I was on the Amtrak from St. Louis, Missouri. I was on my way to Chicago. And there was a gentleman sitting across me, and he kept looking at me in such a very funny way. But I was at peace, knowing fully what I was on the train, so I just felt nothing could go wrong. And eventually, he gathered the courage to speak to me, and he said, "I'm not trying to be funny. I see that you have an app open on your phone. What's the app for?" And to me, it was very funny because I was opening an Uber. And I'm thinking, who in this generation doesn't know Uber? Well, I was polite enough to answer him and explain what Uber is meant for. And the next thing he said was, "I'm not trying to be funny. I've been in jail for over 15 years. I just got out. So I'm trying to understand what this is for." And I explained to him that you can use it to order order a ride. And I think his biggest shock was, "Wait, you get into cars with strangers?" And I said, well, that is the world we live in today. But back to what you were saying around what keeps us up at night is the fact that as you create these apps or you create this product and launch it, there's always new challenges that keep emerging every day, because there are people whose main job is to stay up every day and try to find ways in order to beat your system. So when you think about that, you launch a product, you pop champagne, you're excited, you and your team, you're like, now I can take a long, deserving vacation in Jamaica, and then suddenly your phone keeps blowing up and say you need to come back. So all of that is part of the things that keeps you up every day. Years ago, gift card wasn't really much of a thing. Today, gift card is a lot of things. You give gift cards to people on birthdays and all of that. But as you give those gift cards, you also open yourself as a company, as a platform to risk and fraud exposures as well. So same thing with promo code and all of those nuances. The world we live in today has gone beyond cash. It's now more of a cashless policy. But as we go through those cashless policies, there are so many other things to consider as well. How strong is your background and verification checks? Do you have continuous monitorings in places and all of that? Do you truly understand who the people are on your platform? So these are all of the questions, and when you ask what keeps me up at night, those are the things that keeps me up at night.
Fair point. And in your experience, like, I imagine you use a lot of data to identify and stop fraud and abuse. Which types of data do you leverage the most?
So that's another one. When you look at data, I think part of the issue we have as of today when it comes to e-commerce, P2P, and the rest of payment type is that we look at data in isolation. And you cannot do that. When you look at data in isolation, you're never going to get the true story. The same way you can write a whole book using the 206 alphabets. But when you look at alphabets in isolation, they hardly ever make sense. So when you're thinking about data itself, part of the word I love using most, which I brought from a friend, is unstructured data. Every story you need to tell, from onboarding to the entire life cycle of your sellers or your buyers on your platform, is all embedded in the data. So the question is, what kind of data are you collecting? From name, date of birth, locations, IP addresses, device fingerprint, transaction patterns, values and volumes and behaviors. All of those are essentially important. But I know that for most of us in this room, we will have heard it 1,000 times when you hear things like, we want to create a seamless onboarding experience. I know we've heard it 1,000 times. But I always say that what is the importance of seamless onboarding experience when your platform becomes a haven for fraud and financial crimes? I think at the end of the day, as much as we want to create a platform where people can easily onboard and create less frictions, we should also think about how do we collect this unstructured data and able to tell a story. So there are so many ways to go about that. You can collect this data without essentially impacting users' experience at onboarding and even the entire life cycle on the platform. But also it means a lot of commitment on your side on the back end, meaning that you have to find a balance between automation and manual verifications, meaning that you need to have experts in place that truly understand. They're subject matter experts that truly understand what the industry is all about. And then most importantly, trends and pattern. Like as we go deeper, we're going to be discussing about the psychology of fraud pre and post-pandemic. And all of that is going to tell more stories as we explore.
Awesome, awesome. Well, diving a little deeper here, can you comment a little bit more about KYC specifically and how you verify your users at onboarding?
Absolutely. When you think about KYC, KYB, it's essentially very funny, right? Like companies look at KYC and KYB as something we don't really have to worry about. When you do a projection like quarterly revenue, you think about, oh, for this quarter, we want to make about $5 billion. That's interesting. But at the same time, how many of those $5 billion you might lose to fraud? How many of those $5 billion might ended up you having a breaking news on Twitter where you have reputational damages? How many of those part of that $5 billion might essentially end up in the hand of fraudsters? So these are questions when CEOs, senior executives think about quarterly, they think about revenues. But I always say this. If your revenue is 100%, I don't think it's going to kill you essentially if you take about 5% of that revenue and invest to build a robust KYC, KYB verification program. And I always say this, that KYC, KYB should never be a problem. When it becomes a problem, then that is a real problem you have at hand. Today, the good thing about regulation is that regulation gives you the opportunity to be able to be flexible regarding how you scale your onboarding program across the life cycle of a sellers. There is SDD, which is simplified due diligence. Simplified due diligence is what most industry, as of today, really use, which is essentially selling into the story of creating frictionless onboarding for users at the point of onboarding. SDD essentially focuses on just give us probably your telephone number, your email address, and we can do an OTP verification. And I think you're good to go. You can start transacting. But at the same time, that should be gated because regulations according to regulations, you have to gate it. Probably at 250, at 150, there's a regulatory threshold. And then after that, when users have come to the platform, they've understand how your platform works. They've built trust. There's trust between the two of you. I've sent money on your platform. I've received it. I've bought an item on your platform. I've received it. Now, if you come ahead tomorrow and you say, okay, you know what? I need a social security. I don't think I'm going to have a problem giving you that. That is where CDD comes into place, which is customer due diligence. That's where you start thinking about address verification, social security verification. And then as you go through the journey as well, then at some point you ask for EDD, which is enhanced due diligence. Hey, can you give us your driver's license, your international passport, where we can conduct additional verification on you? And then all of that as you go, you can see how at different stages and phases, you've collected each of this information from your users. And that is what I say when it comes to neobanking and traditional banking. That's essentially one of the major differences. Traditional banking, you walk in, they're asking for your liver and kidney right from the gate. You're not even sure if you're going to use the bank. But neobanking gives you that opportunity to be able to scale. But the opportunity to scale also comes with its own fraud and risk. That is where I said the balance between automation and human verification is essentially important if you really want to have a great scalable program that is able to stand the test of time.
Great. Well, and assuming that you have like a perfect KYC program, right, and like all the users that you onboard are legitimate, et cetera, there's still risk, right? Those accounts can be taken over by someone else, et cetera. So there's still risk at the point of a transaction. And what are the types of data that you look at specifically when they're transacting on your platform?
Firstly, there is no perfect KYC, KYB program anywhere. And that is because human psychology constantly changes and shifts. So just to put in a layman's term, if somebody comes to your door today and the first thing they're going to do is probably knock on your door. And when they knock on your door, you ask, who's there? Or probably today you check your camera to verify who's there. So that is you essentially conducting KYC, KYB. Mm-hmm. You want to know who's coming to your door. And then when they're coming into your house, you can't essentially just leave them and go to your room and go sleep. You want to make sure that whatever they're doing in your house is within what you're comfortable with. That is where transaction monitoring, fraud risk investigations, and continuous investigation comes into place. So here, essentially, it comes down to patterns in values and volumes of business designs. That part of the things in the industry as of today is that there's something called MCC, which is merchant code categories. There is over 200 something of it designed by Card Network. What this does essentially is that when somebody comes onto your platform to create an account, you are able to, based on the questions they answer at the point of KYC, KYB, you are able to put them in a bucket of this is the kind of business you say you want to do. And now each of these businesses has its own transaction patterns, values, and behaviors that you expect. So for the sake of this session, I'll just give you a couple of examples. If somebody comes onto a P2P platform today and they create an account and they say they want to be a taxi driver, you're going to expect low dollars amounts, tips here and there. That is what you expect from their behavior. Now, what happened essentially is that if their transactions suddenly change from an average of $35 to $50 and they start processing $15,000 to $20,000, the rule that you've set for that particular MCC is going to trigger because that transaction pattern doesn't make sense for that kind of particular business. Now, that is where you have a team in place that verify, like, okay, Andres, what is happening? You say you're a taxi driver, and now you're processing $15,000 to $20,000 on particular transactions. It's a long run. And then in situations like that, you reach out. And by the time you reach out to the sellers, they can come back and say, oh, I'm no longer a taxi driver. I've started selling automobiles, which that transaction makes sense for automobiles. So your team conduct the verification, and then they move them away from the MCC of taxi drivers and move them to automobiles. So that way going for $15,000, $20,000 is not going to flag anymore because it makes sense for that particular MCC. Another example real quick is somebody who has a taco truck or a food truck. You expect low dollars amount here and there as well. And then all of a sudden you see a transaction about $5,000 or $10,000. It doesn't make sense for that kind of business. And then you freeze the account based on automation. Then you reach out to conduct more verification and say, what's really going on here? And then they might say, oh, that was for a birthday party. catering service for a birthday party that I was contracted. It makes sense. And then you just make sure, like, as you go, the transaction makes sense back to what was originally designed for. So all of that, when you bring all of that into the entire totality of the story, you don't look at data in isolation. Continuous verification is essentially important. The fact that somebody passed KYC, KYB doesn't necessarily mean that they're low risk. I can legitimately pass KYC, KYB, and I can come to the platform and still conduct fraud.
Yeah, that's a great point. Continuous verification is a must these days. Well, I'll pass it over to you now because I know you have some questions for me, and then we can jump into the details of like the data you're analyzing and all that stuff. Sounds good?
Absolutely. Being on the other side and you being on the other side, what part of the questions I've always wanted to ask you is the first one I have. In your experience, what are the type of behavioral data that is being used in fighting fraud and abuse as of today that you've seen in your experience so far?
Awesome. Sure. Well, before I get into the specific types of data, I would say that, well, we're now in the age of AI, right? And everybody's talking about machine learning models and having like access to the best data, et cetera. And I have to say, most of these fraud issues that we're discussing here, like card not present fraud, account takeovers, like new account fraud, et cetera, they are actually fairly easy to fight if you have access to the right data. And I would say that the three that, based on my experience, we've been seeing the most impact are basically three. The first one is device data. Really understanding which device is that, right? Like, is this user coming from a device that was compromised in the past? Does this device have committed fraud in the past and we already know and we can recognize it? So doing that is extremely important. But the thing is, we know there are many like device fingerprinting solutions out there, but for some of these platforms, committing fraud is actually a real business for the fraudster. They make a lot of money out of that. So they would take the time to do things like resetting their device to factory settings, right? Or having multiple devices that they use, or even having a team with people, each of them using multiple devices. So they are investing to scale this up. So if your device ID or device fingerprinting solution is not able to, for example, link different devices to the same person or recognize if a device was reset, that's not helping much, right? You would see it as a new device, for example, because it was just reset, but it's actually the same person that just defrauded you, right, and took the time to go through that. So again, the right data is super important here. Like just checking the box and saying like, okay, I have a device ID solution is not enough. You have to go deeper and understand if you're covering all of these different vulnerabilities, right? Second type of data is network data, right? And this is another thing that we're very much used to leveraging. IP addresses, understanding if that user is using a VPN or a proxy or something like that, trying to hide their true IP is also important. And in many cases, I have like testing, like I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm just testing. But many platforms that were supposed to block users using VPNs, for example, would only block me if I use a commercial VPN. But wait, if I'm a professional fraudster, I'm not just going to like NordVPN and pay like $10 a month to like, that's not what I'm doing. I'm actually like running an instance on some cloud platform and creating an actual VPN myself to do that. And if that type of thing is not detected, again, like just checking the box for a VPN or proxy detection is not enough. You need to really test it deeply to understand if you're like identifying these what we would tend to call corner cases, but not really corner cases. They're very much widespread, right? So network data is also quite important. And then the last one I would mention would be location data. But not every location data is created equal, right? If we're leveraging the location of the IP address, for example, well, that's very easy to spoof. GPS data is also very easy to spoof. On Android, for example, you just go to the Google Play Store and you type like fake GPS or anything related to that, and you would find hundreds of apps that enable you to spoof the GPS information. Why is that? There's actually a feature built by the operating systems that ended up being exploited as a security vulnerability, which is a feature that was built to enable developers to test their apps as if they were somewhere else, right? So if I'm working for a global company and I'm a software developer, let's say I work for Facebook, right? And I'm currently developing a feature for a market like Argentina, right? And I'm currently here in the Bay Area. How would I test it? Well, I need to have a way to move my GPS position so I can test that feature, right? That feature built by the operating systems for developers ended up being exploited as a security vulnerability to make it easy to spoof GPS data. For iOS, pretty much the same thing. It's as easy as on Android, with one small difference that you need to jailbreak your device, but, well, you just go to any search platform and see how you jailbreak an iPhone. That's fairly easy as well. So again, like, just checking the box and, oh, I have access to GPS data, it's not enough. But if you look into the location behavior information, you can actually do a lot of stuff. For example, within marketplaces, one of the things we see on our network is that about 85% of the accounts are open from home. And the first purchase of a user, 89% of the addresses that are used for shipment are the user's home address. So what does that mean? Well, when the user is opening the account, there is almost 90% chance that this person is at home and is shipping that item to their home. So if you analyze the real-time location of that user, you can already move a lot in terms of verifying this user if they're legitimate or not, right? But on the other side, if we want to leverage location data to block bad actors, we really need more precision, right? Because, for example, let's say I'm a fraudster and I live in a high-rise building in New York, right? There are hundreds of other families in that same building. Well, if you identify that I committed fraud and you want to block me, for leveraging GPS data, you need to block the entire building. So you're actually blocking hundreds of people that have nothing to do with fraud other than having a neighbor who's the fraudster, and they can no longer use your service, right? So you can't do that. But if you are able to get to, like, let's say, apartment level precision, you really can block that specific unit within that building and actually use it as a fraud prevention signal, right? So again, it's all about having access to the right data. If you're analyzing network data, make sure that you are good at identifying VPNs and proxies and other ways to hide the true IP. If you're looking at device fingerprinting data, make sure that you're able to detect if that device was reset, if you're able to link different devices to the same individual. And if you're analyzing location data, make sure that you're leveraging precise information and data that is harder to spoof by fraudsters. So that's what I think about that.
I remember at the beginning of this presentation, you asked what keeps me up at night. I don't think this is going to help me make sleep better at night. I know I have another question for you, but just going back to what you discussed right now around location spoofing. Sanction is one of the biggest hot topic right now in the industry, especially like around different countries being sanction blocked. And for marketplaces and payment industries, processing transactions with any individual from sanctioned jurisdiction is definitely a no-no. Now, everything you've mentioned earlier around being able to manipulate location, in your experience, what kind of advice are you going to give to marketplaces, payment industries when it comes to things like that? Like, how can we manage that location risk specifically? Because that is one of the biggest pain points in the industry as of today.
Perfect. Well, I'd say that the three main techniques to detect location spoofing are around, first, identifying if there is any integrity risk associated to that device, right? So for example, analyzing if there are like remote access malware on that device, if that device is rooted, if that's a real device, because in many cases they're using emulators, for example, to scale up their operations. So emulator detection is also quite important. So I'd say that this first layer here is the most basic, and obviously identify if the user has downloaded one of these fake GPS apps and all of the things associated to it. So that's the first piece. I would call it device integrity or device security, right? The second is more related to analyzing the granular information as well, right? So for example, if I'm spoofing GPS data, right, I'm spoofing the actual like latitude and longitude information that the operating system is sending to the application, right? So what are the other ways that I can get to that lat long without asking the operating system directly, right? There are other ways. For example, you can do that using data like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, right? At this place, there is a unique set of Wi-Fi signals, for example, for the event that are only available here, right? If I cross the street, my phone will no longer see these Wi-Fi networks. So if I have access to the mapping of these Wi-Fi networks and Bluetooth networks, I can find another way to get to the user's latitude and longitude. And then if I compare these two, right, and if I compare what the operating system is telling me, and then I analyze this by myself, and there's a significant difference, you know that there's GPS spoofing going on. The problem is doing that is difficult because you need to have access to a lot of data to map all of these different networks, right? And then the third thing I would say is around analyzing velocity, right? So, well, I can go from the West Coast to the East Coast in like 5-6 hours, right? But if my phone was seen here like 10 a.m. and 30 minutes later I'm in Philadelphia, well, that's impossible. So analyzing these type of patterns is also important. So I would say that these three layers of verification are important to ensure that the location data you're analyzing is legit.
Thank you. So another question for you is, for most people, when you think about it, we look at fraud and scam as probably the same thing. But from your experience and expertise, what are some of the granular differentiators between fraud and scam for marketplaces?
Yeah, I'd say that like the fraud is the more typical like financial loss that you have when you have a user that like used a stolen credit card to pay on your platform, right? Or took over someone else's account that already had stored payment credentials and used that account to make that payment, and then that eventually ends up as a chargeback that you need to fight, right? It varies across industries. When we're talking about banking, for example, you have a lot of like Zelle fraud and like credit fraud and et cetera. But there's usually like a direct link to some sort of financial fraud, financial loss. But when we look at like other types of scams and abuse, you have like promotion abuse, for example, which is very common, right? You have all of these incentive programs. You're like handing out coupons for users so they're incentivized to open an account with you. And then they figure out that they can open hundreds of accounts. Well, they want to, let's say, in food delivery, right? We see people eating for free for a long time, or even throwing out parties with these coupons, right? So ensuring that you're able to detect like multi-accounting, like people creating multiple accounts is super important. And there are other types of scams that apply to specific types of businesses, right? For example, we work with a food delivery company that they were being challenged with a pretty crazy type of scam. What would happen was the delivery driver, they would get to the restaurant, they would pick up the order, and they would cancel it right there. They would say, no, this order is canceled. as a consumer, I would see the push notification saying like, oh, your order was canceled. Okay, fine. Let's try something else. I'm starving here. But 15 minutes later, that same person shows up at my place, knocks on the door, and oh, here's your food. Nice, awesome. Everything looks great, but the payment didn't go through. I think you saw the push notification on your phone that it was canceled. It was actually a bug on the app. But I brought my POS system here, and you can pay it right now. The thing is, that POS was tempered. So when I typed $50, it was actually 5,000. I will swipe my card, $5,000 just went away. The driver would run, and I would need to call the platform saying, hey, give me my $5,000 back. And the platform was like, I didn't see this. I have no visibility about what's going on. So how do you fight this type of scam, right? It's way more complex because you have different parties involved in that transaction. You have the driver, you have the restaurant, you have the consumer. So how would you manage that? So I would say that fighting like the more traditional type of fraud is way easier than these type of scams, especially in marketplaces that are more complex, that have like multiple parties involved in a transaction. Well, we were able to help this company solve it. They reduced it by like 98%, but it was very challenging to figure out like how to catch this before it happened.
Well, I'm not going to be the only one not sleeping well tonight. I think this entire audience. Thank you for digging into that. That is, I believe, like a lot of us had the same wow on our face. It's one of the first time I'm hearing something like this. It's a very unique situation, and I am more than happy to discuss further at some point. One of the last questions that I have on my side is, I know, as much as I want to think like the pandemic is over, I just think we're at peace, just living through it. Pre-pandemic fraud, post-pandemic fraud, in terms of pattern, trend, and changes, what are the things that you've seen?
Well, I would say that two key things have changed. First one is just volumes, and second is fraudsters are more bold these days. They're doing more crazy things. Overall, with all of these programs to provide emergency funds to people during the pandemic, et cetera, it created a huge incentive, right, for people to try to get it twice or 3 times or more, right? So this actually made a lot of people kind of educate themselves on how to commit these type of frauds, and now they're applying these learnings to other businesses and committing more fraud. So I'd say that's one thing. The second is when it comes to volumes, right? If you think about how our lives have changed during the pandemic, we all had to adapt and work from home and change our way of doing things. And one thing that actually happened on the side of crime, right, was that criminals that were on the streets, they also had to adapt. They also had to start working from home and doing things digitally. And they ended up learning a lot of stuff that they're now practicing these days, even though they no longer need to be working from home. But guess what? They figured out it's quite convenient to do that. It's better to be doing that from home than on the streets. So I'll say that these different aspects of the pandemic actually boosted the fraudsters in terms of knowledge and even figuring out new ways to do this. So yeah, it's tense.
I think another one I'm taking with me right now is understanding that criminals also work from home. That is an interesting one. I think those are the questions that I have for you.
Well, I think I have a few more slides from you. So yeah, love to hear your take on on CNP fraud, and I know this is something these forums have been discussing for many years, but would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think like pre our presentation, we actually touched a little bit on this. Is that when people think about ATOs and like account takeovers, as of today, payments industry is focused specifically on new accounts. But the truth is that your system has graduated. The risk you were able to absorb 5, 6 years ago is not what you can absorb today anymore. So the technology and the solutions that you have is way advanced than you did 5, 6 years ago. You've invested in new solution vendors and partners. But one of the biggest mistakes payments industry always make is that we focus too much on new accounts and the security around it, and forget that ATOs usually don't happen with new accounts. They always happen with dormant and hold accounts. Because these accounts that have been on the system pre your new solutions and new vendors and advanced technology. So if somebody want to take over an account as of today, it's always going to be one with weak passwords. It's always going to be ones with funny emails. It's always going to be ones with profile that doesn't even have a profile pictures or incomplete profiles. So as we think about ATOs and all of that, we shouldn't specifically, the biggest risk is not with new accounts. The biggest risk is from hold accounts. And when these hold accounts do comes to play, now you now find yourself in a situation where you're thinking, you have to do a remediation. You have to do a look back, like dig deep into your entire customer database. But I think essentially the reason why companies do that after the time before it become an issue is that they feel like looking back and doing a remediation is more costly, and it doesn't make sense. It doesn't save every dollar and every cent. So it just makes sense to look forward. But the risk you're going to acquire when the ATO does takes place is going to be way higher than whatever dollars or cents you're thinking you're trying to save. So essentially, as we go back to our respective places, those are part of things we should start thinking. These hold accounts, as you enforce new passwords and new password protection and two-step authentications on new accounts, are you doing the same thing with other accounts on your platform? So that is part of the things that I just want to mention real quick here.
Yeah. By the way, just to chime in on this, when it comes to ATO fraud, one of the things I see a lot is many cases like the attack vector is usually phishing or social engineering, right? And performing that is fairly easy on the fraudster side, right? Like you don't need to like have a 100% hit rate. You just need to call a lot of people and figure out how to convince them to share their OTP or whatever, right? And people actually share this. So one important thing to think about is in your authentication flows, can you say that your authentication flow is phishing resistant? If not, you should take a look at like other types of data to ensure that phishing is not enough for the fraudster to bypass your protection, right? So OTPs, for example, not phishing resistant. Passwords, definitely not. But there are other ways to leverage data, and particularly behavioral data, to identify this before it happens. So on the next one, you brought a few recommendations here.
It's part of the things that we've discussed throughout the entire journey. Just a few recommendations that essentially it's helpful. So the first one is around IP addresses and geolocations. When we talk about KYC, KYB is always like know your customers or know your businesses and all of that. Part of it is, can you truly say you know where your customers are from? Outside of data protections and financial crime, from a data gathering perspective, you truly want to know where your customers are from. Is most of our customers coming from Germany? Are they coming from Japan? Are they coming from the United States? It's essentially important because when you're a global company and you run a global program, one approach doesn't fit all. You can't have one control and say the same controls that you have for the United States, what you're going to have for the people in Europe and the UK. Fraud behaviors and patterns is different by locations and jurisdictions. So essentially, collecting this data is very, very important. IP addresses and geolocations is important. And for those who are sanctions experts, you definitely understand the importance of having this data. And if you're one of the companies that you don't collect this data, or you collect, you don't analyze, or you collect, you analyze, and you don't understand, I think it's very, very important that collecting is not just enough. You have to analyze it. Analyzing is not just enough. You have to understand it. And then when you understand that, you can now take it back. It's a feedback cycle. You can now take it back into your program and think of how best way to improve the program. And earlier to what you were discussing around geolocations and location manipulations, these are things that are important as well. 5 minutes you're in San Francisco, 10 minutes you're in Brooklyn. Come on.